Good afternoon and welcome to The Politics of the Portrait, a three-part series exploring the role of portraiture and Black representation in art. I'm Maryam, a postdoctoral research associate here at the center, and I'm delighted to have you all join us. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program is being recorded and your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. So we'll be using the Q&A feature located in your navigation bar to gather your questions, and they'll be answered at the end of the program during discussion after everyone's presented. So please feel free to submit your questions at any time, and hopefully we'll get to them during the discussion after our presentations. Unveiled at the National Portrait Gallery in 2018, the official portraits of President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama, painted by Kahinde Wiley and Amy Sherald, respectively, attracted record-breaking numbers of visitors to the museum. One security guard named Rana, who had the pleasure of guarding the Obama portrait, recounted her experiences of watching visitors interacting with the portraits, from seeing people crying to an elderly woman who got down on her knees to pray. As Rhonda stated of the Obama portraits, no other painting gets the same kind of reactions ever. For the director of the National Portrait Gallery, Kim Sayet, this was an unexpected development in viewership, especially for a museum specializing in portraits of illustrious sitters from Beyonce to Prince to other presidents, which didn't seem to elicit the same reactions. As Sayet observed in an article for The Atlantic, she characterized the popularity of the portraits and the reactions from viewers as a form of secular pilgrimage, with the museum becoming even more popular as a communal gathering place. As I introduced in the first panel of this series, museums have been traditionally the spaces in which we preserve our cultural objects, contextualize them through historical narratives to teach viewers their significance. But who gets to be represented and in what ways? Representation is about power. What museums choose to collect, exhibit, and what narratives they seek to portray impacts the way in which we understand the world, the ways in which we see others, and how others see us. In the wake of the events of the last 18 months, like so many other institutions, the role of art museums and their significance to audiences is being re-examined. What are some new approaches and methodologies in curatorial practice that might provide more equitable narratives? And what are the possibilities of curatorial practice in recovering and resituating Black and Brown representation and portraiture? Today, we hear curators Liz Andrews, Christine Y. Kim, Denise Murrell, and Keely Orgeman discuss their recent projects and upcoming exhibitions and consider the ethical, practical, and historical implications of displaying portraits and figurative artworks in museums. Liz Andrews is formerly the executive administrator in the director's office of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and is now, as of this week, the new executive director of the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art. With a dedication to artists and re-envisioning art history, Dr. Andrews' scholarly work is focused on the intersection of art and social justice. Her dissertation, Envisioning President Barack Obama, focused on the role of visual images in the 2008 election of Barack Obama as the nation's 44th president. LACMA Curator of Contemporary Art, Christine Y. Kim, is curator of Julie Meritu, a mid-career survey of the artist's work co-organized with the Whitney Museum of American Art, where it is currently installed. Kim also curated Isaac Julian's Playtime in 2018, Diana Thader, The Sympathetic Imagination in 2015, My Barbarian, Double Agency in 2015, James Turrell, A Retrospective in 2013, which was awarded for the first place for the best monographic museum exhibition in the US by the International Arts Critics Association in 2014. Other exhibitions include Human Nature, Contemporary Art from the Collection, and Teresa Margolis, an outdoor sculpture project in collaboration with the Los Angeles Nomadic Division, a nonprofit organization for public art, which she co-founded in 2009. And prior to her move to Los Angeles, Kim was associate curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, where she curated numerous solo and group exhibitions, and very important ones as well, I might add, including Flow in 2008, Kahinde Wiley, World Stage, Africa, Lagos, and Dakar, Philosophy of Time Travel, Henry Taylor, Sisson Bra, Frequency, and Freestyle. A recipient of the New Leadership Award from Art Table, Kim was co-curator of the 12th Gwangju Biennale, Imagine Borders, and curatorial advisor for Prospect 3, Notes for Now, from New Orleans in 2014, amongst other international biennales and exhibitions. Kim is also co-founder and board member of GYOPO, a diasporic Korean contemporary art and culture nonprofit based in LA and started in 2017. And Kim's next exhibition at LACMA include the Obama portraits and Black American portraiture. Keely Orgeman is the Seymour H. Knox Jr. Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. Committed to supporting the visual arts within the New Haven community, Orgeman actively mentors curatorial fellows at Next Haven, the New Haven-based arts incubator co-founded by artist Titus Kavar, and is also helping to lead the 2021 Connecticut Happy and Bob Duran Artist in Residence program, a partnership between the gallery and Art Space New Haven that supports 5 Connecticut-based artists. In 2017, she organized the gallery's exhibition Lumia, Thomas Wilfred, and the Art of Light, which traveled to the Smithsonian American Art Museum and is currently co-organizing 2 upcoming exhibitions, including the project with artist Micheline Thomas that Orgeman will discuss today. And finally, Denise Murrell is an associate curator of 19th and 20th century art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She's currently developing exhibitions, acquisitions, and installations on the Harlem Renaissance and to reflect on the multifaceted Black presence in 19th century European art. She works with contemporary artists whose practice is engaged with the interrogation of art history. Dr. Murrell was the curator of the 2018 exhibition, Posing Modernity, the Black Model from Manet and Matisse to Today at Columbia University's Wallach Art Gallery as the Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Research Scholar. She was a co-curator of the exhibition's expansion at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris and a guest lecturer for its final tour at the Memorial Act in Guadeloupe. Her Posing Modernity exhibition catalog, based on her doctoral thesis, received book awards from the College Art Association and the Daedalus Foundation. She previously held a Mellon predoctoral fellowship at Princeton University Art Museum and taught art history at Columbia in New York and Paris. So please join me again in welcoming Liz, Christine, Keely, and Denise to today's panel discussion. And again, a note on format, each panelist will present uninterrupted, and then we'll all gather together at the end of the presentations for discussion and Q&A. And again, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat box at any time.
Thank you, Maryam, and thank you also to Courtney and the Yale Center for British Art for inviting us to participate on this panel and the opportunity to discuss our work at LACMA. It's really an honor to present alongside Keely Orgeman and Denise Murrell, and my co-curator Christine Y. Kim and I will be presenting 2 exhibitions opening at LACMA this November, the Obama Portraits and Black American Portraits. This November, the official Obama portraits are coming to LACMA from the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery as a part of a 5-city national tour. The paintings by Kahinde Wiley and Amy Sherald are both radical departures from presidential portraits before. Wiley's painting of Barack Obama is significant not only because Obama was the first African-American president, but also because of the symbolism. The colorful background of the portrait invokes Obama's multicultural background, with African blue lilies from Kenya, chrysanthemums, the flower of Chicago, and white jasmine representing his birthplace of Hawaii. Sherald's colorful portrait of Michelle Obama captures her in a dress with a bold geometric pattern that references several art historical practices, including Black quilting traditions. At the unveiling of the portraits in 2018, Kahinde Wiley shared something about his practice and the Obama portraits. He said that growing up in Los Angeles, California, and going to museums like the Getty, the Huntington, and LACMA, he didn't see representations of people who happened to look like him. And in fact, he chose to become an artist to correct this omission of Black figures in museums. The fact that the Obamas chose to be rendered by Black artists builds on a history of Black Americans using portraiture as a tool for self-fashioning. The conventions of presidential portraiture were established with images of the first president, George Washington, who was a powerful unifying symbol in the early years of the Republic. The National Portrait Gallery claims that this portrait was more important to the formation of the United States of America than the founding documents because it helped solidify the idea visually of the United States in the minds of people. Here you see on the left a painting of Elihu Yale. Like the image of Washington, this image conveys power through pose, dress, and possessions. On the right-hand side of the portrait, we see a young Black boy looking at Yale as the subject of the portrait, and he wears a collar that is made of metal to denote his enslaved status. His presence, the presence of this young Black boy, elevates Yale as the subject of the portrait and punctuates the freedom and power of this white subject. Then the artwork on the right-hand side is a contemporary response to this work by the artist Titus Kavar, who received his MFA from Yale. In this remixed version of the image, Kavar has crumpled the portion of the picture depicting Yale and reframed the boy as the subject of the portrait. He no longer wears a collar, and now he looks directly at the viewer. The title of the work is Enough About You, as if to say, enough about portraiture as a medium exclusively for wealthy white sitters. And so to complement the historic presentation of the Obama portraits at LACMA, we are presenting Black American portraits. We are including works primarily from the collection that highlight a history of America through 200 years of portraiture. This show underscores the ways in which Black Americans have used portraits to envision themselves and reimagine Blackness in their own eyes. The oldest work in the exhibition is this portrait of a man thought to be Paul Cuff, a free Black and Indigenous sailor who lived in New England in the late 1700s. Cuff amassed a fleet of vessels and ultimately sailed many freed African Americans to Sierra Leone. This portrait is highly unusual because the power of portraiture was not commonly available to Black subjects at that time. Black American portraits will feature nearly 150 works of art depicting Blackness as powerful, beautiful, joyful, and nuanced. The invention and proliferation of photography coincided with emancipation and provided a new platform for self-representation. As scholar Deborah Willis writes, photography documented the promise and hope of emancipation through the subject's framing, pose, and dress. Their clothing and gazes highlighted their sense of racial pride, end quote. These early photos include props such as books, American flags, and the cherished possessions of people who were once owned themselves. Photography is a strong theme in the show because it enabled Black people to see themselves through their own eyes for the first time. The show spans time and includes works made in 2021, including this augmented reality monument, or AR monument, by the artist Ada Pinkston and dedicated to Biddy Mason. Biddy Mason was a Black woman born into slavery who went on to win her freedom and own land in present-day Los Angeles. This work is part of LACMA and SNAP, Monumental Perspectives, an initiative bringing together artists and technologists to consider representation, monumentality, and to illuminate histories of Southern California. This augmented reality artwork will expand the reach of Black American portraits to LACMA's outdoor public plaza. The inclusion of this work is part of our commitment to diversity and inclusion on all levels. We have a range of works, artistic practices and strategies, mediums, materials, technologies, and artists. And we are also using this opportunity to reconceptualize public programming, opening events, support models, communications, and printed matter to be more expansive and inclusive.
This exhibition is also a tribute to the historic show, 2 Centuries of Black American Art from 1976, guest curated by artist, art historian, and scholar David Driscoll, who sadly passed away last year from COVID. It was the first comprehensive survey of African American art and the most highly attended show at LACMA at the time. While today the show is hailed and honored as one of LACMA's greatest moment, it was not an easy show for LACMA in 1976, in that there was great discomfort with centering Blackness at this large county museum. Plus, unfortunately, like many museums, LACMA did not invest in acquiring work by artists in the exhibition or by artists of color in general, and we have been playing catch up ever since, certainly since I arrived 12 years ago. Facing our institutional history with honesty and humility, we are re-foregrounding Driscoll's shape-shifting exhibition by thinking about institutional practice and evolution and what curating and portraiture mean or can mean in the age of Black Lives Matter amidst the COVID pandemic and the vast social and racial inequities that it has laid bare, and to re-examine and redirect a multiplicity of differently scaled efforts and initiatives concurrently, internally, and externally. In this way, we're really at the beginning, and there is so much work to do. And I'm going to rewind to June 2020 to explain a bit about how our approach came together or came into sharper focus and how we developed another register around our curatorial conceit and principles. And to do that, there was an article by Elizabeth Alexander in the New Yorker in June of last year that really had an impact, among other podcasts, articles, literature. I'm sure that we're consuming, most of us at the time, and hopefully still continue to do. While bystander and victim footage and body cam video have been incredible resources for documenting the threat and violence that Black and Brown people face daily, there's another side to consider: the people who experience it firsthand and who are confronted with it ad nauseum via social media. Alexander questions in this article, what does this do to young people of the Trayvon generation who grew up in the past 25 years? She points out the spectacle, commodification, and consumption of Black pain and its re-traumatizing effects on young people, especially during COVID, when all of our mobile devices have become communication and media lifelines to the world. And it led us to a series of questions, or these general kind of ideas around thinking about the individuals portrayed, who's portraying them, how are they being portrayed in social media, body cam footage, et cetera. How can we as a museum institution counter or challenge the commodification, spectacle, and consumption of Black pain and trauma? Who sees themselves in pictures, where, and how? And who else is looking? So this kind of mise en abîme of looking at the portrait, who's in the portrait, who's looking at that, what surrounds that, and kind of as a matrix and a structure. What are the structures that museums have in place to expand, to contract, to move, to share the collection, the walls of the galleries, the fundraising muscle, the community that's already engaged, et cetera? And what is our responsibility, function, and purpose to LA County and to wider publics? Next slide, please. There are several themes woven throughout Black American portraits, including portrayals of queer people, families and communities, street and quotidian life, mysticism, spirituality, mythology, Afrofuturism, literature, art history, complexities and dynamics of self-portraiture, and a history of Black figuration in Los Angeles. We don't have an endowment at LACMA for acquisitions, and we fundraise to purchase works or solicit gifts. And as many of you know, at museums, we're talking about works that we want to bring into the collection and not just those that are offered based on collectors' market and tax deduction interests, for example. And it takes an enormous amount of time and effort to fundraise and to kind of get all of these pieces in place, which especially for this show has been central to our project. I am pleased to share with you that we have acquired nearly 40 works of art in the collection, not necessarily these works. This is just a sample of the works. And we will include these works in the show, and we continue to work on more acquisitions because this is where we make a real big difference kind of in perpetuity. Shows come and go, but works in the collection and scholarship carry a different permanence. One of the newest works in Black American portraits and in the collection is An Ocean Away. Cheryl uses her signature grayscale approach to brown skin tones to depict two Black surfers resting on a beach in Far Rockaway, New York. Contrasting historically negative associations in images with Black bodies in water, namely the transatlantic slave trade and the segregation of public pools during the Jim Crow era, this double portrait shows Black people, here a surfing coach and a student, who have come to the water of their own accord to ride the waves and experience a sense of freedom and leisure. And we see here Cheryl reunited with First Lady Michelle Obama in LA. That was the last slide just a couple months ago. And then finally, we just wanted to end with this series, the 3 images of Frederick Douglass that are in the exhibition. Abolitionists who escaped enslavement in 1838, just as the photographic process, the daguerreotype, was being introduced in the United States, Douglass went on to become the most photographic American of his time, sitting for over 160 portraits, more than Abraham Lincoln. Douglass believed that photography would reveal the truth and humanity of enslaved African Americans and help realize the promise of democracy. Quote, Negroes can never have impartial portraits at the hands of white artists, end quote, he claimed, end quote. What was once the special and exclusive luxury of the rich and great is now the privilege of all, end quote. Black artists today reference Douglass's likeness and his teachings on photography and emancipation to underscore the importance of self-representing Blackness, challenging stereotypes, and resisting racist classifications. Black American Portraits features several images honoring the legacy of Douglass, including this 1876 photograph and posthumous portraits by Charles White from 1950 and Isaac Julian from 2019. And I'll just end with a final Frederick Douglass quote. The whole soul of man is a sort of picture gallery, a grand panorama in which all the great facts of the universe, in tracing things of time and things of eternity, are painted. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Maryam, and my other colleagues at the Yale Center for British Art for the invitation to participate on this important panel. My presentation offers a brief overview of the exhibition that I'm co-curating with the artist Micheline Thomas for the Yale University Art Gallery and possibly for another venue in fall 2023. Since graduating from the Yale School of Art in 2002, Thomas has gained an international reputation for her work on Black women, mostly members of her family or social circle, whose portraits she renders in photography and other media. The image on your screen represents such a portrait, the only work by Thomas currently in Yale's collection. I invite you to visit the gallery in the fall to see this photograph featured in an expansive exhibition of paintings, sculpture, video, and works on paper by women graduates of Yale, opening on September 10th. Many of Thomas's recent and most ambitious works have literally enfolded her photographic portraits and her viewers into large-scale installations. These are domestic interiors that recall the family home of her youth in the 1970s, decorated not only with furniture that has been upholstered in dazzling fabrics, but also with textured floor and ceiling tiles, lush-looking plants, faux wood paneling, patterned wallpaper, and prominently hung artworks made both by Thomas and other artists. In this installation, which is part of the multi-level exhibition, Micheline Thomas, A Moment's Pleasure, currently on view at the Baltimore Museum of Art, one of Thomas's portraits is placed above the couch at the far right end of the lobby. And here, the artist has transformed a balcony into a living room, complete with a couch, coffee table, framed photographs by her, and stacks of books by famous Black authors. For Thomas, these installations partly function as offerings of comfort and safety for the African diasporic community, inviting them to feel at home. And relatedly, the artist's portraits serve as a way for her to address history and the entanglements of race, sexuality, power in traditional European and American representations of Black figures. The exhibition on which Thomas and I are working together for fall 2023 positions her in the dual role of artist and curator. It takes Thomas's 1970s inspired environments and pulls them several decades backward into early American history, blending her work with portraits of Black American sitters from the pre-emancipation period. This group of small-scale objects, which vary in format from miniatures and early photographs to silhouettes on paper and frontispiece engravings and books, will be shown in cabinets, in cases, and on the walls, entirely situated within new immersive installations that Thomas will design specifically for this exhibition. And in addition to the fact that intimate portraits such as these three examples on the screen were made to fit in the palm of one's hands, they were also intended to be displayed in the home rather than in public. Thomas's full-scale setting for the works will evoke this private context, eliciting consideration of the environment in which the portraits would have originally been viewed. Just as Thomas's evocative spaces engender a sense of communal belonging, our exhibition seeks to reveal previously unknown or unnoticed associations among the sitters in the portraits, often through the overlapping aspects of their individual stories. This project, along with its accompanying publication, marks the first attempt to assemble these rarely seen portraits and consider them as a group. And I want to note here that some of the works are pending approval for loan from museums and private collections, though Thomas and I have already begun to study these portraits in depth. Among the historical objects we've identified for the exhibition are several miniatures painted on thin sheets of ivory or paper, including this pair depicting a couple believed to have lived in Philadelphia, shown here with a tiny detail of the woman's clothing and jewelry. By contrast, these two portrait miniatures are seemingly unrelated to each other, except in the barely noticeable details, such as the red pins worn on the men's lapels and the hoop earrings in their ears, which may be markers that link the sitters to New Orleans or the French West Indies, according to our preliminary research. The central and defining object of the exhibition will be the gallery's recently acquired watercolor on ivory portrait of Rose Prentice, who was enslaved in Massachusetts and New Hampshire before being freed and moving to Boston, where the prominent miniaturist Sarah Goodrich rendered her likeness in about 1837. Discoveries about Rose Prentice's life have largely occurred through archival research after the gallery acquired this miniature in 2017. Some intricate details of her portrait, for example, the madras headscarf, the pearl earring, the fancy ruff that are shown in these micrographs, stand out only when one closely examines the image. For our exhibition, Thomas and I have drawn connections between the portraits, partly from similar details that can be perceived in them, especially in instances when little or no identifying records about the sitters have been uncovered. These two portraits show the two portraits on the one on the left and the one at center show as yet unidentified sitters, one of whom holds a 9-string banjo, and the other who wears a cap, earrings, and brooch while holding a fan and daguerreotype case in her hands. At right, another striking portrait shows a woman identified as Martha Ann Adavis, an enslaved domestic worker in Baltimore. Martha Ann Adavis's piercing stare and printed cotton dress betray a certain self-fashioning and awareness of her own presentation. Though separated by geography, Rose Prentice and Martha Ann Adavis shared the lived experiences of enslavement and domestic labor, as did other women whose biographies are better known. Such examples range from the colonial era engraving of Phyllis Wheatley. Next slide, please. The first Black American woman to publish poetry, to, on the right, a later amateur painter's portrait miniature of Elizabeth Freeman, the first Black woman to file a successful lawsuit for freedom in the state of Massachusetts. Maryam, could you please just go back one slide just to show those two portraits? Thank you. Joining the dozen or so works presented today, including these two miniatures, will be approximately 25 other small portraits of various media that we intend to include in the exhibition. And then on to the next slide, please. What is held in the sitter's hands or worn on their bodies becomes a prompt for the viewer's consideration. Does the portrait represent how an individual wished to be remembered? Or does it communicate the ambitions and interests of others? In many instances, these portraits were commissioned not by the sitters for their own use or appreciation, or to exchange with loved ones. Instead, many were commissioned by white patrons, often for keeping in their own homes when the individual was considered a beloved member of the quote-unquote family, or under slavery when that sitter served as a symbol of familial wealth and property. Each small image embodies these complex relationships between artist, patron, and sitter, thus intermingling race and power, and indeed violence, primarily in ways that are no longer visible. The separation of individuals from their families, the subjugation of the sitters, as well as the denial of possession of their own likenesses in the form of a portrait, are just some of the manifestations of violence inextricably linked to many of the works. In our exhibition, these histories of racial violence will be made as explicit as the visual and conceptual overlaps on which I have focused in this preview. Thank you for listening, and I'm eager to engage in our fuller conversation after Denise speaks.
Thank you again, Maryam and Jane, for the honor of participating in this very timely and necessary panel today. I wanted to summarize aspects of the critical framework that shaped my 2018 Posing Modernity exhibition, specifically around the idea of portraiture, and to share some of my current thinking about its implications for my curatorial practice and for revisionary histories of art. My premise has been that changing representations of the Black, especially female figure, including by long overlooked and marginalized artists of color, were central to the history of modern art from Manet's own time through to early 20th century modernism and the global contemporary moment. Much of my work has involved the excavation and restitution of the identities of models and artists of color, a multi-medium approach to gallery displays, and the retitling of outmoded racialized nomenclature, all in the service of simply establishing a presence, a modern Black presence in every aspect of creative endeavor during the era of empire, enslavement, and colonialism, and into the afterlife and continuities of these forces that we still live with today. In thinking through the question of portraiture and representation, I show here Manet's portrait of the model Laura, who posed the maid in Olympia, a detail of which was seen in the first slide, whom Manet named in his studio notebook and described as a very beautiful Black woman. This documentation of Laura's specific identity raises the question of what lived reality Laura's portrait represents. And it is with this photograph of the period that I believe we have a glimpse into what Manet was seeing and describing. A stylish but modest young woman in a white dress with a delicate neckline. The identity of the woman in the portrait remains unknown. But even though Manet describes Laura as beautiful, I see his portrait as more about modernity than beauty. Modern because the sitter's social role is unclear. She is not overtly a servant or a sex worker. She could be a shop girl or a restaurant waitress. This contingency of social role, leaving it to the viewer's own perception, as well as the new painting style which this portrait is rendered, combine, in my view, to make this portrait a work of modern art. I also came to see how essential photography was to this project of getting at what Manet's portrayals of Laura represent. Despite certain modernizing and de-exoticizing gestures in especially the portrayal, this portrayal of Laura in Olympia, we have to see that Manet's modernity was a fraught modernity. He places her in the heart of modern Parisian life, but still as an archetypal servant. It's in the photography of the period that we see Black personae at every level of Parisian society, shown with a measure of self-fashioning, as these portraits were sometimes commissioned, and a dignified reserve. We see the stylish young student. We see the matron, including on the top right here, a portrayal of a visiting wife of a British mayor. These images typically did not exist in painted portraits, so we must look to photography to see the wide-ranging presence of Black women in the Paris of Manet's era. Now, this excavation via photography of identities has been an ongoing process for me, and it has continued to amaze me to see the extent to which quite extensive information is often available about seemingly anonymous photographs, that this information has helped me and other scholars to piece together a narrative of the Black community in Paris and elsewhere in 19th century Europe. So this portrait photograph of Madame Archer is an example of how just below the surface information about identities can be. There was no information about this portrait when I came across it, other than the title, which describes her as the wife of the mayor of Battersea, when I came across it in the Bibliothèque Nationale. I included it in my show in the catalog. And after a lunchtime lecture that I gave at the National Gallery, London, a Black British scholar, keying off the description as the wife of the mayor of Battersea, gave me the full name of her husband, John Archer, even though she'd never seen this photograph of his wife. We have since been able to use these fragments to reconstruct a more complete picture of Madame Archer's biography, from her Canadian origins through to the couple's time in Paris for the first Pan-African conference organized by W.E.B. Du Bois, and their contributions to the African-American journal, The Crisis. I continue to work with the show's revelation of the breadth of portrayals of Black Parisians in thinking about how to open up the narratives in traditional monographic surveys, even of the best known artists. The Impressionist Degas, well known for his paintings of ballerinas, also captured other scenes of modern spectacle and performance. Here I show, together with his better known portrayals, these two representations of Miss Lala, a famed Black biracial acrobat at the circus in his neighborhood. Degas did more studies of Miss Lala than for any ballet painting, experimenting in pastels with his placement of the figure to capture the ornate architectural setting. My sense is that Degas captures the artistry of this act of almost superhuman athletic strength. She is portrayed in one of her signature acts, being raised to the ceiling, suspended only by a device clenched between her teeth. He focuses less on the strength than on the acrobat's self-styling. The placement of her hands and her feet resonate with his portrayals of ballerinas. My continuing work, drawing from the second half of Postmodernity, deals with the emergence of Black modernism in the US during the early 20th century, when we saw the emergence of what we now describe as the Harlem Renaissance as the first Black-led school of modern art. These artists describe their subjects from across the social spectrum as the new Negro. It's defined by philosopher Alain Locke, a modern Black, painted in a modern way, blending pictorial flatness, African sculptural or classical and classicized influences to convey all aspects of everyday African-American life, especially in the new Black cities being formed in the early decades of the Great Migration. As art historian Rick Powell wrote about Alston's portrayal here, or painting here, Girl in a Red Dress, which was a recent acquisition at the Met, this young woman is unabashedly Black, beautiful, but also utterly modern, urbane, cosmopolitan, and depicted with an enigmatic affect, the contemplative gaze to the side that conveys an interiority and the psychological depth absent in the racial stereotyping that characterized the period. I often show here a portrait excavated from the Met's holdings, acquired in 1942, but never until now shown in the Met's galleries, by Samuel Joseph Brown, quite well known in his own time, but has fallen into obscurity today. But I believe that his self-portrait captures in a uniquely modern way the aesthetic of the new Negro and possibly, arguably, W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of the double consciousness of the modern Black psyche. And I just show here a range of images to capture the fact that the new Negro artists often spent extended periods of expatriation in Paris and elsewhere in Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, before returning home to portray these new Black cities that arose from the Great Migration. My first Met exhibition, which will open in March 2024, will explore the formation of this movement of Black modernism in the US, and then examine its central role within transatlantic modernism. Now, as I move to close here, I wanted to step back in history for a moment to stress the importance to my practice, to my current work, of bringing collaboration and the idea of multiple voices to the interpretation of challenging images from the past as we begin to rethink if and how these works should be presented in our galleries. And I focus here on the 17th century French portrait of an aristocrat by Lars Gillier and her Black servant, who is deliberately shadowy here, but on close scrutiny, we see that he is wearing a gleaming slave collar. Our discussions within the European Paintings Department about this painting were fraught. I and others felt that we had to directly state that such images are an overt depiction of the racial hierarchies that informed the ideologies of empire and enslavement. We wanted to call out the unseen violence, and we took a collaborative effort. We developed the gallery label, which for the first time addresses some of these issues, specifically with the sentence noting that this portrait is an explicit document of the reality of a societal structure based on theories of pseudoscientific racism formulated in government-sanctioned academies. So these are the types of revisions that we are making as we look at these works of art, going back into the history of Western art. Slide, please. It was especially meaningful for me to work with this Lars Gillier because it had been a site of intervention by the contemporary artist Titus Kavar, whose work exemplifies my continuing engagement with living artists whose practice is involved in the interrogation of art history. As Titus Kavar described in a recent magazine interview, his interest is in the potential to amend art history, but not to discard it. In Seeing Through Time, which is based loosely on the Lars Gillier painting, the form of the French aristocrat being hollowed out and replaced with the visage of a modern Black woman, he is creating a space for a young Black page to encounter, to engage with, and to represent contemporary ideas. He replaces the slave collar that the servant would have worn in this original painting with a cravat. These two paintings create a conversation between the historic and contemporary representation of Black people over the course of art history. And then finally, this artistic voice is manifest in a very recent painting by Titus Kavar, which we acquired at the Met last year. Here we see Kavar deploying the pictorial tropes of art history to represent a current Black mother grappling with the loss of her child due to the racially charged forces of recent American history. This despairing figure evokes Renaissance and Baroque tropes of Madonnas, Magdalenes, Cleopatras, and Pietas. For while her rare portrayal of a Black woman with her own child refuses the archetypal servant caring for the children of an employer or an enslaver. The excision of the lost child, cut out with a razor blade, reinforces the causal factors of gun, police, and environmental violence, leaving only the shadow of the child's bodily contours projected against presumably a metaphorically white wall. So these are some of the ideas that I've been thinking about in my 18 months now at the Met. And I look forward to discussing this and more with my colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, I'd love to invite back up. Here we all are. Thank you so much, Denise, Keely, Liz, and Christine, for really spectacular presentations. And it was really uplifting to see so many amazing portraits and paintings of Black self-actualization. That was really great to see that. And sometimes, given historical paintings and some of the issues that we face as people who work in museums, as curators, these images can sometimes be hard to find, not only in our collections, but also in these exhibitions. So it's really great to be able to see them today. I'd love to maybe just start off by thinking of one sort of broad question, in all of your exhibitions, I'd like to know what sort of new approaches and what sort of methodologies in your curatorial practice in these exhibitions you found that create these equitable narratives that do become voices of Black self-actualization. Of course, these portraits that we do see do that work in some ways, but Denise, for example, you talk about collaboration being important and integral, and also Keely, you're collaborating with Micheline, an artist who is also co-curating this exhibition with you. You've also mentioned, Denise, about multiple voices being important for that narrative, and you talked a little bit about interpretation and that process in terms of the label making, texts and panels, and how we might change those to shift the narrative to be more equitable. So I'd love to just hear some of your thoughts on your own processes in terms of your exhibitions.
I can start. In thinking about the exhibition that Micheline and I are co-organizing, I think that the context of the historical and contemporary works are interconnected, interrelated, and very meaningful. And I think for us, or at least I'll speak for myself, the function of this counterpoint or juxtaposition between the works is not to collapse the individual stories into some kind of monolithic one, but rather it's to convey that the histories of these objects would be incomplete without consideration of the additional context that is underscored by Micheline's work in particular. But I think it also functions the other way around, which is to say that Mickling's work cannot be fully understood without considering these related histories through the earlier objects, as she has been referencing in her work for decades now.
Keely, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, yes, I think that collaboration with artists whose practice engages with these tropes of art history is absolutely essential to the overall presentation of Blackness in a museum collection, certainly encyclopedic museums like the Met. But I also think that it is essential that we, the curators, do the work as well. And this means for many curators, the need to develop new ways of thinking about works for which the body of knowledge has been assumed to be established for decades, if not centuries. And I think that the way to do this, or certainly one way to do it, is to step away from the tradition of the authority of the single voice, speaking in a manner that presents a particular interpretation as fact, as the final and the only way to think about a given body of work, and to open these narratives up to discourse, to debate, discussion, disagreement, to completely different points of view that can be credibly brought to the same work of art. And this is quite a major transition, I think, for many museums, but I think it's an important one. I think it can be only a transition. I would like to think that after a period of doing this type of collaborative work with multiple voices, we will have a new generation of art historians and scholars who have absorbed these disparate threads, perspective into a more coherent single point of view.
Maybe we'll all pick up, and Denise will remember this moment at the Studio Museum. Recently, I was asked to speak about Freestyle, which was 20 years ago. And I haven't agreed to do the talk yet because I got to get my mind in order. But I started thinking about what it was at the time that made this show in terms of audience, in terms of institutional structures, curatorial methodologies, made the show so shape-shifting and radical at the time. And I think one of those things is, prior to that, I think an understanding around contemporary Black art was in these kind of general eras or moments, whether it's Black arts movement figuration in the 70s, the kind of energy experimentation with abstraction in the 80s, and the kind of 90s multiculturalism. And so in the early aughts, when the show was, putting work out there where you have Jenny C. Jones looking at minimalism and sound, Eric Wesley looking at humor, Seminam Okudzeto looking at figuration, but also the phone bill, and the phone bill for me also connoting internet. Oh, well, of course, at the time, now we have cell phones, but there's international phone bills, or, incarcerated family members or friends. I mean, the phone bill is such a prominent thing, but that all of these artists were making work in such diverse mediums, strategies, materials, concepts, so that in a way, multiplicity was kind of the revelation there. And all of these artists in some way, definitely in the way they talked about the work and the way that one could really see when you look at the detail. And, Keely, you were looking closely at the lace and the brooch and the image and the pin and these things. When you look closely, that there's so many things that are tied to kind of markers of identity and, of course, race. And so I think in many ways, fast forward 2 decades and kind of what that show and many other shows and books sort of opened up, we're at this moment again where, of course, the multiplicity and polyvalent kind of approaches to things, as well as collaboration. Liz and I are not scholars in the same era, and we have reached across, curators in our modern department, prints and drawings, because there are processes in printmaking we're not, trained in, for example, or even photography for that matter. And photography, it figures so centrally in this, but technical aspects, so on and so forth. So both on the level of kind of technical, pragmatic, art historical, but like that, I think, idea of when you kind of show that multiplicity and that range, both in the selection of artists, that can be kind of extended into the structure, the process, the scholarship, and the forming of an idea. So as Liz mentioned in our presentation, I mean, this is work in augmented reality, in printmaking, in quilts, in photography, in sculpture, the whole range. We also have self-taught artists, showing alongside Barclay Hendricks and Kahinde Wiley. It's not just the Yale trained, what I mean? Like that can be taken up, that kind of idea, I think, within an institution can be applied to different areas, and also beyond just the selection of artists, selection of works, and collaboration among curators and even across institutions, that's where then we can start thinking about how that could reflect kind of audience development, community engagement, these who is the sitter in these images, and where the dynamisms I think really get interesting in there is, and I won't go on for too long, but really is around the self-portraits, the artist's self-portraits. Arthur J. Fa, Jordan Castile, Margaret Burroughs, Carrie James Marshall. These are some of the artists that James Van Der Zee, we have some self-portraits of. And I feel like that's where then you kind of get the duality of the kind of interiority of one's self-representation, self-portraiture, and at the same time, these kind of wider dynamisms around looking and seeing and possibilities.
I'm going to ask some questions from the audience. We've got several here. One by Margaret Spillane. She says, thank you to all of you for this illuminating presentation. And a quick question. Since children of color visiting museums often search in vain for representations of people who look like themselves, I'm wondering if education programs in museums are offering classes in which children of color can learn to render, as McLean Thomas does, portraits of their close relatives and friends, as well as to make self-portraits. So this is a question about museum education. What are your departments doing in terms of these kinds of things in the education department in your museums?
I can start with that. We have a wonderful head of education at LACMA, Naima Keith, who we've been working very closely with throughout this process. And so the short answer is yes, there are programs, there's a whole family guide with activities that people can take from the gallery and take home with them to continue educating themselves, but also learning to make images themselves. So I think that in addition to talking about the engagement with contemporary artists and the impetus to make sure that you're, as the curator, doing this work of comparing the history with the reality of contemporary, integrating and education is a really huge part of it, and making sure that you're lockstep with the programs and the offerings. So it's something that we take very seriously at LACMA to make sure that all of our visitors across LA County of all ages see themselves there, and that we, instead of having the Kahinde Wiley who doesn't see themselves there, but have the young people who come in and are inspired because they see themselves on the walls. And so we're really looking forward to the ways that we've kind of changed things up with this exhibition.
I'll also add to that, I think we all agree that it's time that we try harder to stop segregating our audiences. I'll put it bluntly, in that, like, if you're a lender to this show, if you're a donor to the show, you come to this dinner or you go into this private reception. And if you're just the public, you get in line to buy your ticket, and so kind of breaking down these ideas, because the truth is, I think we should be at a moment where a funder or a lender can come and see galleries full of kids, and that is the reward, not the champagne flute. I mean, we want to honor the people who support us, of course, but like, what can that look like, and how can that offer new spaces of seeing, like, oh, what I contributed toward, this is the end result. So one thing that we're doing that we had great success with around Julie Meritu's exhibition, which was not an easy shift, was to, instead of a kind of opening model of the hors d'oeuvres and the private lunch and so on and so forth, that we're planning an open house, and truly everyone is invited, and that the activities there really, we're thinking about what do people enjoy. I mean, they wanted, a DJ, a dance, as opposed to, I don't know, string quartet, whatever. I mean, nothing against string quartets, but just like thinking through, the kind of what sort of out in the world, when we say, museums say we want to attract more diverse audiences and create greater inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what are the things that we're doing that are attracting or not attracting people? Of course, there's the art, but let's think about all of this other stuff together.
Christine, I very much agree with what you were saying about kind of the commingling of the various sectors of our audience. And I think this applies to curators too. I've observed how sometimes the more experienced a curator becomes, the more remote they become from direct contact with audiences, with the public, speaking at large lectures, taking limited questions. But as somebody who during my grad school years spent more than 5 years giving gallery talks at the Met on Friday evenings for whoever showed up, there's a lot of learning to be gained from direct, unmediated contact with the public, and having a sense of the types of questions, the ways of looking and thinking and receiving works of art that can often be surprising to those of us who come at it from a primarily academic point of view. So I'm an advocate of having curators get out there a little bit more ourselves.
That brings me to a question I was thinking of. In the introduction, I mentioned how Kim Sayed saw the National Portrait Gallery with Obama's portraits as being a place where communal belonging should occur, and to think about the museum as a community space. And I think, in the last 18 months, we've all, Bridget Cook said this to us 2 weeks ago, that we're all the survivors of a pandemic, one that's still ongoing. We all need therapy, what's more therapeutic than art, visual culture and these great things. And how can we do that through what we display, in terms of our collections? How do we move, from the traditionally conservative space of the museum to something that's more comfortable for all audiences, not for audiences that maybe necessarily feel always welcome in the space, but those who have historically felt unwelcome in the space? I'd love to just talk a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Well, one thing that, I'm sorry, Liz, were you about to speak? Okay,
sure, but go ahead.
Okay. No, I was going to say that one thing that we thought about at the Met is how to make works of art that would be of interest most readily available, findable, if you will, to the various folks who walk in the door. And there is, on the one hand, a point of view that says you shouldn't necessarily publish online a digital map that highlights works of art by African-American contemporary artists. But there are others who say in the, I don't know how many miles of gallery space at the Met, it can be difficult, especially for the first-time visitor or families, people who are coming as families with young children, to easily pinpoint works that could be compelling and of interest. And I think there is good reason to have more guidance, to have more direction, to help folks figure out their way around these very large, these encyclopedic museums.
I absolutely agree with that. Wow. I was going to say, for this exhibition, Black American Portraits at LACMA, it's revealing because institutional shifts are tough. If you've done things the same way a long time, it's really difficult, I think, for every part of the museum to approach things differently, which is what we've been trying to do. And so thinking about the show, which has yet to open, but will be open for 6 months starting in the fall, it involves, thinking about marketing, completely differently. It involves thinking about the fundraising, who we're approaching completely differently. And that, it takes a lot of conversations and, just trying to move the needle a little bit here and there. And I think the only way that can really happen is if it's an institutional priority. If the institution at the highest level says, we have a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and we want this to permeate throughout the museum and all of our operations, I think that's really necessary. And it's not just the curatorial aspects of it that go into that. It's really the people in communications who are interacting with the public. And again, with that question about education, making sure that once people are there, they are engaged. And so when I think about what goes into making sure that people are welcome at the museum, first of all, it's making sure that they even know that things are there and making sure that you meet people where they are in order to even engage them to come in the first place.
Speaking of the public, let's see if we can tackle some questions from our public today. One question from somebody anonymous would like to know about the inclusion of vernacular images in these exhibitions alongside artworks by well-known fine artists. Do you think that this reflects a longer trend of broadening fine art and curatorial practice and research to include objects that are maybe more generally considered material culture?
I would say, speaking only for the project that I addressed in my presentation, that portrait miniatures, for example, have been part of the gallery's collection for decades now, and they've always been presented alongside other objects in the museum. Similarly, silhouettes, not so much photography, early photography, that's, I think, probably something that the museum has collected more recently, but it's not a trend for us, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. It's something that, showing these objects has been part of our practice.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think trend is not a word that I would use either. I think, one great example of this kind of collapsing would be Lynn Cook's American Vanguard Art exhibition, where there was, ceramics and miniatures and self-taught and visionary and vernacular and quilts and, the whole range of things. But I think where we do see a shift is more of a willingness, a boldness, an acceptance, or kind of curatorial specificity around, in a space, there's a reason why that miniature is alongside that quilt, is alongside this sculpture. That the connections that we can draw now, don't have to be in this kind of sealed in these types of categorical, hierarchical, all the things in this room are of a, the way that we sort of, the framing of it, the classification of it, so that we can get more deep into the kind of collapsing of different objects, narratives, kind of motifs and markers, and not necessarily from a kind of, external decorative visual way, but from a historic, specific at that moment, and then to kind of re-enliven what those connections are, because that kind of almost like cacophony sometimes, polyvalent, multi-layered cacophonies, or can be perceived as cacophonies, were actually ways in which people at that time, or that specific artist or community or whatever you're talking about, it was naturally layered. It's kind of like when people think, the artist has this studio and it's like this Jackson Pollock splashing around in this paint. No, like they watch TV, they're listening to to just almost see the artist. I think it starts there. The artist as a person who goes to the market and has a kid and, calls their grandma or, whatever, like all these kinds of things. So that sort of dynamism can enter at all these different spaces, and most certainly in curatorial methodologies.
Well, we have about 4 minutes left, so I want to see if we can tackle one more question here from the audience. Jane Trowell asks, what is the equivalent action in a picture gallery or museum of the toppling of statues of racists? I think we're thinking about the public monuments that have been toppled in the last year and a half. How do you feel about the difference between anti-racist activism against statues and paintings? Is there a difference? What are the similarities and differences?
For me, it's context. I think that what museums can do is take images and contextualize them in a manner that can dismantle the often propagandistic simplicity and directness of the types of statues that are being challenged in public spaces today. I think that if you show a statue of a white man on horseback and Native American on walking beside on one side and African American walking on the other in a public space with no context, no history, then that can convey a political stance, a social and cultural sense, what the relative position of these individuals would be in society. If that statue were to go into a museum and be shown in an exhibition that can bring other visual and textual and other means of interpretation to the way that the viewer receives it, I think it can be educational in a way that it may not be in a public space. And that is not to argue for or against. I don't, in any kind of across the board way, argue for or against the removal of monuments. I think it has to be case specific. But I do think that there is the opportunity, if museums take that opportunity, to contextualize in a way that can dismantle racism. One other point, I was speaking with an artist in the galleries recently. We were looking at that Lars Gillier painting that I showed you, the French aristocrat with a black slate. And he said, every word you say about that black figure is an act of anti-racism, because the entire construct of that painting was that you say nothing and that you pay no attention to that figure at all. So that's the one that helps to, that in my mind, captures the point.
Would anyone else like to weigh in? Well, I think we are about out of time, and I want to thank you all. I want to thank our panelists, Liz and Christine, Denise and Keely, for such engaging presentations, for hearing about your projects, your past and your upcoming projects, and this rich, engaging conversation. I only wish we had more time to talk and discuss some of these points. I also want to thank the audience who tuned in to listen, and to let you know that on September 17th, we hope you'll join us for a panel with artist in conversation with Titus Kavar, talking about his practice with collectors Arthur Lewis and Hound Nguyen. That was, again, September 17th from noon to 1:30, and you can find that link on our website at the Yale Center for British Art's website. Again, thank you so much to my panelists, and thank you to our audience for listening, and have a great day.